So I wanted to film this so some of you guys out there that are considering replacing your input shaft have a good idea of what we're doing and what's involved. I pulled this transmission out, and this is the guide tube for the throwout bearing, how it's snapped off. I've heard some people go and make some statements that basically the throwout bearing goes bad and breaks this. Well, that's not entirely true. The manufacturing process for this, it just sucks. They, however they put this through, they didn't do a very good job of it, and this is definitely a weak spot. So there's a couple places that have these. This is a brand new one. I got this from Lethal Performance. It comes just like this with the O-ring. It's also got the seal in here. This basically is going to drop in here, and I got to drive it in with a hammer. I separated everything out so it wouldn't get dirty. This is the original input shaft. This is a 10 spline. Normally you'd replace this if you're beefing this up with a 26 spline, which are these splines right here. Anyhow, there are two races that slide right in here. One right there and one right here. And this bearing rides in that race. If you get a new one of these, what you're ended up doing is you're putting in a different shim to keep the race up a little bit higher. And I've got those in another bag. Again, keeping everything clean is absolutely important. I'm going to clean off the O-ring, everything, before I put it in and drive it in. But ultimately, not too tough of a job to replace. Okay, so this is the new shaft installed. And basically, the O-ring's underneath of here. I cleaned it up really well. If there's any type of particulate, it's going to make it leak. So I didn't use a hammer, I used an actual press with a socket. Some people mentioned using the old input shaft. I would recommend not using that, and the reason being, it's pretty much the same diameter as this piece. So if you're not careful, you're going to, well, more than likely you're going to. If you use it, you're going to damage this piece right here. And this is what that shim rides at. The tolerances on this are super tight, so the last thing we want to do is damage this. So I'm going to put some ATF on here. Again, Dextron 3 with Mercon, and then I'm going to assemble it. The surface right here, I ended up cleaning this. You can see the factory machine marks, and you're not going to get these out. So since there's ridges in here, you can't just use, like, and I wouldn't recommend it anyways, any type of scraper. What I ended up using was one of those blue scrubby pads, like you get like just in a kitchen. I kind of wouldn't recommend it, and the reason being, it did a really good job, but it left a bunch of particulates inside here, and I had to come back and clean all this stuff out. The last thing I want to do is have something get caught in the bearings. So I'm just going to put a real thin coating of transmission fluid on a lot of these parts, and then also a thin coating of the black RTV on the surface area. Make sure it's clean, make sure there's nothing sticking up, and most importantly, no residual gasket material. One last thing before I put this in. This shaft, you got to make sure it's up and in place. It can slide out just a little bit, not all the way, but it can slide out. And then this shaft, I'm going to pull this out real quick. So again, just make sure that this synchro is lined up. And if you're curious about this, I don't know if this is the Kevlar material inside, but this cone-shaped material, it just fits over it. And the synchro part, the funny thing is what gets it to lock in, it's not these teeth, it's the cone shape. So if I push in here, it'll want to stick, and then it'll line it up. And then the teeth will end up lining up, and then they'll drop in place. But yeah, the actual part that slows it down, it's not the teeth grinding up against each other. It's this material inside going up against this shape. So I'm just going to drop this in first. That is if it'll cooperate. There we go. Then we're going to grab the input shaft. Line it up with the gears. And there we go. It's dropped in. It's all the way up. It's all the way up. I also cleaned this spot off, and I put a little bit of transmission fluid on the inside of the seal. Put a little bit more in the race. The thing is, when I put the RTV on here, I don't want oil transmission fluid getting on it. So anyways, but the race is in here. Both of these have shims. You don't want to force these. If you can pull on them from either side. But yeah, here's the other shim. To be honest with you, I'm not even sure how you would go about checking the clearances on these. I can get it with the in-play on the shaft. Anyhow, that's it. It's ready to go together. Everything's in place. If I was replacing this input shaft, I would not be using RTV just yet. I would go and I would put this together and check the in-play on the clearance. But considering that this is all stock setup and I am not a transmission shop, I'm just going to put it together and hope for the best. Okay, so I finished putting it in. Unfortunately, this is actually the second time. So I got pretty much next to nothing as far as in-play on this. I assembled this the first time and something slipped during the assembly process. I don't know if it was the synchro, one of the shafts slid forward, but I couldn't get this to spin. So off it came. I pulled everything off, re-cleaned it. The other thing is, before we go and do anything further, I want to make sure, this isn't tight by the way, but MGW short throw shifter. I want to make sure that everything shifts into gear properly and I can still spin the input shaft. So it's all back together. Here's a second note, and for whatever reason these are hard to find. This right here, this is the original, I forget what they call it. It's a ball stud basically, and this is what the clutch fork rides on. But you can see how badly it's worn, mostly because I probably just didn't do an adequate job of putting grease on this the last time or from Ford. But it just basically goes right in here, into this bolt hole, and then it rides on it. Now, I left the throwout bearing at the shop, but there's two things that I bought. These components, by the way, this is straight how I bought it. It's got this grease from the factory. These are two separate parts, and this one right here is really hard to come by. I think by the time that I got everything said and done, this bolt was over $50, and then I had to pay for some shipping to get it here. All in all, I think it cost me around $70 for this bolt. You can buy adjustable ones for more like $20, and that might be the better option. There's a couple things about this arm. I replaced it just because I didn't want to guess at having a bad component. And the other thing is this piece right here, where the plate rides in on the bottom, it was pretty badly worn. Now, if you guys are looking at this and wondering why this clutch arm looks different, it's because this comes with the factory. I believe this is a 2-pound weight that attaches here. I might have been able to get a different one. Here's the Ford part number. It's a 7515 is what's important. Anyways, this is an OEM part. I'm going to put it back in. You got to make sure what I'm going to do, and I didn't do this on the last one. The biggest concern is you put grease on here to keep it from basically the clutch disc, which it's only going to be moving a couple millimeters, but I imagine that it could wear over time. The big concern is this thing spins on this car up to 6,500 RPMs. And anything on here is going to start slinging off. It's going to end up coming off the splines, and it's going to end up on your friction material. So definitely not a good thing. Some people just don't use it at all. In my case, because I have the old one, and I looked at it, like this piece right here, this does not spin at that RPM. Only the throwout bearing, the face of it, which I don't have with me, spins at that. So this I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to put a thin coating of grease. I can see that there was some wear on this shaft beforehand, and I'm trying to prevent that. The other thing is, and I've heard people recommend this, not spinning at that high of a speed. Grease here, grease here, grease on basically the springs that are holding the throwout bearing. A little bit of grease here where the cable ties in, and then also some grease here, which was provided by the factory. So I'd say if you're going to do a rule of thumb, don't get grease on a part that's moving at 6,000 RPMs. It's going to sling off and get everywhere, and we're going to have some undesirable issues with that. So I'm going to go through here. I'll probably put some Loctite on here just because. But I'll put it on here. An interesting thing when you go to put this transmission up for the Cobras, you're going to put everything together, and then you're going to slide this in place, and you're going to leave it there, and you're going to put the transmission in with this arm in place, because it just goes through this slit right here. And that's about it.